Now, witnesses at the impeachment inquiry have testified that a White House meeting with Ukraine was conditional on an investigation into Donald Trump's political rivals. Top Russia expert Fiona Hill also used the proceedings to pour cold water over several Republican theories, including that Ukraine meddled in the 2016 election.
The witnesses said it was well known by high-ranking officials the investigations wanted by the president involved not just Burisma but the Bidens, despite other witnesses saying they didn't know there was a connection.
By this point, it was clear that Burisma was code for the Bidens.
Former National Security aide Fiona Hill and Foreign Service Officer David Holmes testified how the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, was working through a second channel of policymaking to get an investigation into the Bidens.
In the months leading up to that, from May onwards, it became very clear that the White House meeting itself was being predicated on other issues, namely investigations and the questions about the election interference in 2016.
Holmes says he was told by Ambassador Gordon Sondland that President Trump only cared about the big stuff.
Did he explain what he meant by big stuff?
Well, I asked him, well, what kind of big stuff? We have big stuff going on here, like a war with Russia, and he said, no, big stuff like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani is pushing.
Allies of the president continue to argue there's never been any wrongdoing nor a cover-up, and Ukraine ultimately was given military aid.
There is nothing different in there than what we had on the transcript.
The White House saying in a statement, these two witnesses, just like the rest, have no personal or direct knowledge regarding why U.S. aid was temporarily withheld. So what's next in the impeachment inquiry? Well, it's still not clear. Currently, there are no other open hearings scheduled, but that could change. As of Friday, the House is in recess through Thanksgiving, and they won't return until December.
Joining us live for more on this and everything international is James Brown from the United States Studies Centre. James, thank you for your time.
Good morning.
Now, the impeachment inquiry, this is an interesting pivot to see it turn towards the Ukraine evidence. Where did this come from, this idea that there was Ukraine meddling in the 2016 election, not Russia?
Well, that's become the focus of the discussions on the impeachment hearings this morning, the idea that somehow Ukraine was trying to influence the outcome of the US election or had the capacity to do that at the same time it was fighting an existential war against Russia. I think Fiona Hill, the former national security staffer, did a good job of debunking that, and she went through it quite methodically this morning under questioning from both majority and minority representatives on the committee. But it was another official backing up the story that Sondland presented earlier in the week about just how determined the president was to see this investigation happen and to do whatever they could to leverage the investigation as an outcome.
And the issue with that is, even if it's proven at this point, it still has to go through Congress at the impeachment inquiry. How likely is this to really be damaging for Donald Trump long term?
Well, I think the Republican defence overnight was a bit muddled, not their best performance in terms of bringing these witnesses down, but where they've had the most success in their narrative this week is around asking the question, is this really treason, high crime or misdemeanor? Yes, this happened to an extent. Yes, the president was interested in seeing this investigation, but is this actually a crime that deserves someone who's been elected by so many Americans to be convicted and removed from office?
And where do you think this plays for Donald Trump going into the election campaign in the next year? We've seen things ramping up on the Democrat side. Michael Bloomberg might be wading in, but it seems like it might just be firing up his base.
Absolutely, and the narrative he's pumping out of the White House is the Democrats don't care about the future of the economy, they don't care about the future of jobs, they don't care about bringing US manufacturing back. All they want to do is play their games of political intrigue and run this impeachment inquiry, and we saw that this morning from the minority representative on the committee, Devin Nunes, who was basically saying this is a complete waste of time and a distraction. We need to be getting back to the issues that voters care about. That will have some traction as long as the economy continues to perform well.
Now, if we look at one of the other interesting stories happening in the international space, Duncan Lewis, former boss of ASIO, has had some really interesting comments about Chinese interference in Australia and just how cautious we should be about it. This is becoming an increasing issue in Australia.
I think we've got to take these comments from Duncan Lewis very seriously. He's had the background not only as the Chief of Defence Force, he's worked in Special Forces, he worked as the National Security Advisor, and of course his final role as the head of ASIO. His comments were very wide-reaching. He essentially said that if you are a political player in Australia, you should expect some degree of Chinese interest and some degree of Chinese attempts to influence you. And he pointed to the inability of political parties particularly to deal with these kind of issues, to be prepared for them. So I think that would send a chill certainly through this building, but certainly for the public. It helps to bring a little bit out into the open what the security agencies are dealing with and just why they're so concerned about interference, not only from China potentially, but from other countries too. And
it's a real issue. We've had the hack on Parliament emails last year that everyone seems to agree was China, even if that's not the official line. It's something where it's just that balancing act. How do we interact with China when they're one of their biggest trading partner, the most important, but at the same time, serious concerns about their human rights record?
Yeah, I think we used to have this kind of dual-track conversation. We'd say to China, well, we're very concerned about, you know, the cyber penetration of Australia, and they would say, yes, we have problems with cyber security as well, and isn't it terrible? I think we're now getting to a more pointed conversation where we're essentially drawing boundaries and saying, you know, there are limits. We expect that you will have an interest in what Australia is thinking and what we're doing. There are ways you can influence that are acceptable, and there are ways that aren't, and this is the boundary. And where you cross that boundary, we will talk about it publicly, we will call it out. I mean, there's a lot more information flowing into the public domain, whether that's through official statements or whether that's through unofficial channels, but the effect is the same, to make the public much more aware of activities that China is conducting that aren't acceptable in the Australian government's view. And that's the problem that China's having at the moment, is they can't figure out a way to stop this information coming out. We're all watching Hong Kong just in absolute awe that this has been going on for months, and they can't control the public perception, which is so important to them. Yeah, I mean, if you're in a one-party state where you know, the president's thoughts are being reflected on by university academics a day a week, reportedly. They're being told they need to set aside time to think about President Xi Jinping's thoughts and vision. There's not a lot of room for dissent, and that's why we saw the Hastie and Patterson visit rejected. That's why we're seeing this absolute sensitivity about any criticism from Australian officials. That is really interesting, that visit being canned, because it does show that they will take a very hard line, very public line when they are offended. But at the same time, Australia can't afford to just be going to China slavishly following whatever they say. We're not calling out these international issues, because then it compromises our core values. Yeah, and I think in the past, I mean, I think you think back to Julia Bishop's visit to China, where she was ambushed in the press conference and given a dressing down by the Chinese foreign minister and extensively criticised in front of Chinese and international media. I mean, Australia's only giving what it's prepared to get. So, you know, we take criticism when other countries don't agree with what we do. We expect that where we disagree with what China's doing, particularly on human rights, we'll be able to make those comments. And I think the foreign minister's been very forward-leaning and consistent on not only making comments about Xinjiang or Hong Kong, but also asserting, whilst we respect Chinese sovereignty, we'll continue to make those comments. Should we be reading anything into the fact that the Prime Minister hasn't been invited to China yet? You can read into that. These things are always difficult. There's scheduling issues. There's a question of what you do when you go there. There's no point in going to China unless you've got some business to transact. I think, you know, the Prime Minister's got a pretty aggressive foreign meeting schedule next year. He's off to India for a big visit in January. It would make sense to go to China at some point next year if he's able to do that. We'll all be watching. James Brown, thank you so much for your time, as always. No problem.